As I mentioned before, um, creating creating procedures and implementing them into the district is something that I take pride in, something that I did directly here with the 7 schools that I was in charge of. So the first thing I did was to something simple. The home language survey, when students received a registration package, was the same as the rest of the documents. So all I did was simply change the color of the home language survey to give it its importance. I also identified for the parent and for the school a connection that needed to be made when it came to inputting information into Genesis or Power Schools. So in Genesis, it's just an example. The confusing component was primary language versus home language. So these two were being inverted, and then the data wasn't correct, and students weren't being properly placed or properly coded for funding reasons and for state reasons. So if you ask yourself, what does this mean? I'll give you an example. You have a student like myself that was born and raised in the United States. So I was born in Harlem. I grew up in Newark. Mhm. At home, as I mentioned, I only spoke Spanish. So I am registering for kindergarten, and my mother receives this home language survey. Mhm. Parents didn't know what the difference was between the primary language and a home language, and the school didn't either. What it means is this: when you speak to your child at home, do you speak to them in Spanish or in English or in French or in Creole or in Italian or in Portuguese? And that's where you select what language is spoken at home. Meaning, if you live with your grandparents and your aunts and your cousins live all in one household, what language does everybody that lives in that house speak? Now, the primary language is when you speak to your child in X language, what do they respond to you in? Do they respond to you in Spanish? Do they respond to you in English? Do they respond to you in Italian, Creole, French, Italian, Portuguese? And that is the difference. Regardless if they mark, if they mark English for both, then the child doesn't get tested. But if the primary language is marked that the child is responding in English only, but the home language survey, meaning in the household, another language is spoken other than English, we test the child because we want to make sure that we understand the type of learner we have in the classroom, but it does not mean that the services will all be given to the child. And then when we test them, we take these factors into consideration, and that was not being done. Something simple, but made a huge difference. The second step that I did was I selected an administrative assistant, one per school, to be the point person to receive the registration material, input the registration material into Genesis correctly, particularly for me, the home language survey into Genesis correctly. The third thing I did was assign a duty, or either a media specialist, a teacher, or if the schools had a duty period for teachers. I assigned guidance counselors. Depending on the school, the nature of the school, I adjusted it, but I had someone assigned to test and provide the WIDA screener correctly to the children, and or for bilingual purposes, provide them with the language proficiency test, which is, it was either a Spanish language test, Portuguese, French language test, Italian language test, to be able to assess their language abilities. Because sometimes what happens is the child could be illiterate in Spanish and illiterate in English, so they don't know either one. Knowing that information is going to help us to educate and teach this child. Then the fourth thing I did was create a Google form for the entire district to communicate with one another. but it also was important because for auditing reasons, if I were to be audited, I had the information easily, very organized, and provided a lot of information for anyone inquiring. So let me show you that now. So this is just an example of a spreadsheet. And as you could see, it's only for the month of September. The important components is you have to have the date when the child registered. You have to have a date when the child started. Now, this date is important because this date tells you that you have 30 days to send the parents information whether their child needs ESL bilingual, what program they need, so that the parent has the right to refuse that service. And then what I did was, student ID to make it confidential. If needed, I erased their names here, the grade levels, and then other important components, the home language survey information, the test score, what the test score range was, where they were going to be placed. This is for funding reasons, because this translates into Genesis or Power Schools, the date they were tested, the type of test they were given, the different levels of it, and then to ensure they, what their scores were, listening, reading, writing, speaking. When the teacher receives this information, they'll know where the child's strengths are. So, example, this child obtained a 6 out of 10 in writing, which means they're not just beginning, they're not just starting. Their speaking was strong. There's 4 different levels of the speaking for the screener. So the reading, they were at from 0 to 10, they were at a 7. So here you could see what type of student you're going to receive. Although the test was the easiest version, it was a test version A, and there's a test version B for the screener. It does show the type of student that's going to enter the program. And that's for an elementary school. For middle school, it's a little similar. You still always have the stapled information that we need. And then you have the test information, the test results, and where the child is going to be placed. In the middle school at the time, we had levels. We had level 1, grades 5, 6, level 2, grade 5, 6, level 1, 7, 8, and level 2, 7, 8. So depending on the grade and their proficiency level, we would place the child and give them a schedule. So this information gave you that. And then for registration, attendance reasons, program funding, you label the child appropriately based on the schedule. So that was important communication that wasn't happening before. And in high school, it was a little different because, as I mentioned, we have the native and non-native track. So here we would place the raw score. This raw score, WL, means the world language, their native language score, to show how proficient they were. So if you see a student here pre-AP, that means they're entering the school system with a high level of native 1. So their language abilities in their first language is very high, which is great because most of the time it translates into their second language, which is English. So here you could see the connection that the child received a tier A test, but scored high enough that they were able to be placed in an ESL 3 based on the screener information. So just, information like that was very important, and I would change it. This is the whole district, and I would change it every month.